the first part of our series on homestead firewood, we showed you the techniques that we use to bring a tree safely down to the ground. In today's part, we're going to show you how we process that tree and how we use every single part of it. Hello, welcome to English Country Life. Welcome to the garden. Welcome to episode 2 of firewood processing. We left off last time with a tree safely brought down to the ground. And if you haven't seen that episode, I'll put a link somewhere up above and you can look at that episode. What we're going to do today is slightly different then. What we're going to do is process that tree now that it's down on the ground. And we're going to do that in 3 major parts. We're going to consider the brushwood, the twiggy stuff. We're going to consider the limbs, the larger branches, and we're going to consider the trunk. Each one needs different tools and different techniques. Let's get started. In this wooden crate, there's a lot of old, dry, twiggy material. And that might give you a clue as to what we do with some of the brash. But let's look at it in a bit more detail. As we're processing a tree, we'll take a lot of that brash or brushwood material and we'll cut it up into pieces, maybe 30 centimetres, a foot long. We're really looking for the stuff that's sort of pencil thick. That's ideal for these purposes. And what we're going to do is season that and it becomes our kindling for the following winter. Now, we just sort of shove it into these big wooden crates, and the crates are kind of big and tough and they're given to us by a farmer friend very kindly. And we'll cover them with some of these roofing material that we've got left over from the renovations. And we'll leave that stuff to dry out all summer long for the following winter. We don't need all the brush to create kindling. So the next job then is we fire up the chipper. This chipper is a bit of a beast. It's an old thing and it's a wonderful present from our great mate engineer Dave. Although it perhaps isn't in the first flush of its youth, it fairly rips through the brushwood that we get from tree felling, etc. As you can see, it eats the stuff up, but you do need ear protection and you do need eye protection. You can see the bits of those wood flying around with the thing. But if you look at the side of it, you can see the rate at which it pumps out that chip. And to be honest, the small electric domestic ones are fine for a few hedge trimmings, but really they're not good enough if you've got a lot of brush to process. Once we get these chippings, they're ever so useful. We use them as paths around the greenhouse, down the side of the house. We use them as mulch around the fruit beds and in the fruit cages. And in that area, what it does is it suppresses weeds, it holds in moisture, and eventually it rots back and it actually adds nutrients to the land. This is what we call the log shed. It's an old tumble-down single garage, but perfectly good for keeping wood dry. You can also see it's got a pallet floor. We just put old pallets in it, but those pallets get the wood up off the floor when it's drying, and that's really important. You don't want it absorbing ground moisture. Behind us, you can see some of the big limbs from that ash tree and the smaller stuff, and I keep them fairly separate because when I start the stove I want small stuff, then when I just want to keep it ticking over I want to add some big stuff into the stove. So it's handy to be able to get some of each, take it into the cottage so that I've got the right fuel to keep the stove going all day and night. There is something that's quite important to mention though as well, other than, oh my goodness, storing your own firewood needs some space. Think about this. This wood is at the back and I'm going to fill this over the next few months. But the older stuff's going to be at the back. And that's not really very good because I want to start with the oldest and use the newest. So you need multiple places to store your firewood. So you can have a place for this year's firewood, a place for next year's firewood, a place for the year after's firewood. And I'll show you in a minute some of the solutions that we've come up with for that. But a bit of organisation does go a long way. Let me show you how we process these limbs and very quickly how we store some of that wood. If you are going to cut up a lot of limbs because you're falling trees, this kind of saw bench is a game changer. You can make them or buy them, but notice that there are those 3 big U-shaped sections that are held above the main body of the saw bench itself. And that's where the magic happens, because you can pack those U shapes with lots and lots of the smaller 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch size branches, lock them in place with a bar or a chain, and then fire up your saw. And what I find the best way of attacking them is to take the little bits that are hanging over the ends off first, and you can already see how quickly the saw goes through, and then cut through the middle between the bars. And you're not cutting one little branch after another, you're cutting 30 or 40 or 50 at a time that way. And it really does save an enormous amount of time. And when you've finished the second section, you'll often find they sort of just stay stacked in place, and you need to almost shake them loose. But they're there, they're all in one place. And remember I showed you earlier that I store the small stuff separately? Well, it's very easy to quickly transfer those to their own little stack for starting the log burning stove in the winter. And as you can see, that sort of bench can take some quite chunky stuff as well. 6-inch limbs are really no problem at all. Once it's all cut up, just to show you as we said, we will store 1 year's worth on pallets or in those wooden crates that we showed earlier in the yard, covered in solid roofing sheets which don't flap like tarpaulins do. And the next year we'll use the log shed that we showed you at the beginning. Well, we've dealt with the brash, we've dealt with the limbs. We're now in a position that we've got to deal with the trunk. Obviously it gets cut into sections with the saw, and then it has to be split down. And there's some useful tips and tricks we can share on how we do that. Before we split anything, let me show you something. If you try and split a workpiece down on the ground, around about your ankles, only the tip of the bit of the axe is actually going to touch the workpiece, and you've gone way past the most powerful part of the stroke, which is when the axe is at 90 degrees. Get yourself a big log, get your workpiece up around knee height, and all of the bit of the axe is going to come into contact with your workpiece, and you're at the most powerful part of the stroke when you bring the axe down onto the log. Now have a look at this. I'm using a working axe here, and I don't have to work hard. I'm not really throwing my shoulders into it. The weight of the axe does the work, and the wood just pops apart. Now I'd like to take a quick look at that axe. This is the working axe that I was using, and it's actually designed to fell a tree, to cut across the grain. And look how thin the blades of that axe are, because they're designed to penetrate when you're cutting into hard wood. But to split, you need to go down through the fibres and force them apart. Now this is a tool called a maul, and if you look at the blade of a maul, it's at a much more obtuse angle. It's really wide and wedge shaped, designed to drive into a log, force the fibres apart. But it can be a bit heavy, and it can honestly be a bit crude at this size. So this again is the axe, and I'm showing you now the maul that I like best. It's a narrow, it's still wedge shaped, but it's a narrower angle. It's got a hardened pole on the back that acts as a sledgehammer, and you use this kind of maul often when combined with steel splitting wedges, and I'd like to show you that technique. This is how that sort of maul works. You're not actually necessarily trying to split on its own, but you're starting a crack with the maul. And then you take a proper steel splitting wedge, pop it into the crack that you've started, flip them all over and tap that wedge home. And you can see 3 light taps and it's done. Some workpieces are bigger, and then I'll switch to a bigger sledgehammer, and I'm actually having to drive that wedge into the workpiece. And as you can see, sometimes you drive it all the way in and you'll get a crack started, but the log is so big it's just not going to let go. So that's not a problem with the wedging technique. All you do is pick up a second wedge, fit it in, either start it with the maul or into the crack you've already started, and often you can just tap that one in and the crack will continue. But you may need 3 or even 4 wedges sometimes. There is another technique that I really like and I want to show you here. And what I'm trying to do here is to not split the log across the middle, but to take shavings off the edge with them all. Doesn't always work, and sometimes the maul will stick a little bit, but what I'm doing is effectively striking a much smaller split across the edges of the log, and I keep turning the log, bringing off useful fire-sized pieces of wood that way. A few years ago, Fiona bought me this wonderful device. This is a hydraulic log splitter. This one has its own electric motor. You can get them with petrol motors, you can get them that run from the power takeoff of tractors. But they're deceptively powerful. That's a very large log that's split using this, and it exerts about 7 tons of force, this one. And as you can see, they don't look that scary, but you do need to wear eye protection. Particularly smaller parts can leap up at you because of the pressure in the grain. Now, you know, I've used these for several hours at a time, and as I'm getting older, I have to say a hydraulic splitter is something that means I can carry on with a wood burning stove, where if I had to split everything by hand, that wouldn't be easy. One little tip though, you'll see an axe on my belt a lot of the time, and often these will still leave some wood grains connected. So having a small hand axe just to chop through is helpful. The last little thing I'm going to say is you're going to get to these little pieces of wood somewhere in processing a tree. The crown or the crutch of a tree where branches go all over. I don't even try and split that. The grain runs always. Anything like that, pop it on a knee-high block, fire up the chainsaw and simply cut them up. Because honestly, splitting them is more trouble than it's worth. That's just an overview of how we go from tree to finished firewood ready for seasoning. If you've enjoyed that, can you spare us 5 seconds and give us a thumbs up down below? If you'd love some more detail on saw sharpening or felling a tree using only hand tools, let us know in the comments and we'll make those videos for you. If you want to see those videos and all the other topics we cover on self-reliant living, hit that subscribe button, hit the bell next to it. You'll hear every time we upload a new video. But whatever you do, come back and see us soon. Take care.